Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. This video is an album review on Alan Parsons Project 1980 album called A Turn of a Friendly Card. This was the band's fifth album. This is their second time on the channel. I did review Vulture Culture previously, and I gave that album a 54 out of 100. I thought it was a pretty good album. I've always had a soft spot for Alan Parsons Project, and even though they're not really probably fitting in with what my channel is with the electronic music and things like that, there's some prog rock here and there that I like, and some, certain things that kind of in my collection that, that I still want to review and I still enjoy. So, I kind of squeezed them into my channel, and Alan Parsons Project is certainly one of those. They're certainly tied to Pink Floyd in some ways because, Alan Parsons engineered, Pink Floyd. So they're kind of tied to prog rock, and they certainly do some instrumentals and, a lot of solos and you know, develop tracks in a prog rock way. But I would probably most consider them more of a soft rock, band, and a little bit of prog rock in there and sort of that balance. But I've always had a soft spot for them. I remember when Eye in the Sky came out, I was like 7 or 8 years old, and I thought that song was so unusual for the time, and it was so catchy and so different than what else was on the radio. And so I think over the years, I've always had, whenever I would see them in a record store, I'd pick up their records until I had most of their collection. And so I think at some point I'll probably review everything that I have by them. But this album was their fifth album, and it is the album right before they went, supernova with Eye in the Sky. But this album still did fairly well in the charts. I mean, it was top 20 in a lot of countries. It had two top 20 hits in America. So they were definitely progressing towards a breakout of some sort if they had the right song to do it. And sure enough, Eye in the Sky was the song to do it. But I feel kind of little sad that people think they're a one hit wonder. There's so much more to enjoy in their catalog, and every one of their albums I would probably put in the pretty good to good range. I don't know if I'd say any of their albums really is very good, although I will say their 1994 album, I think, or 1997, I think it's called Time. That one is a really strong, almost a comeback album because they kind of stopped making albums for a few years in their late 80s and early 90s. But I'll probably get a chance to review all their records and see if any of them get into the sevens. But all of them are pretty good to good and enjoyable records. I don't think there's certainly some cheesiness in Alan Parsons Project. Sometimes their lyrics, are kind of so straightforward, and they almost sound like they're trying to like write poetry, and maybe, you know if you've ever tried to write poetry, like maybe I tried to write poetry when I was a kid, like it didn't go very well, and it takes a lot of skill to write poetry that isn't, roses are red, violets are blue type thing. Like, it's not hard to write. I mean, it's hard to write poetry, and let alone to not make it cheesy and to make you actually think, and it be ironic, and be all the things that good poetry can be. Sometimes the lyrics of Alan Parsons Project seems a little bit like poetry, and maybe sometimes a little obvious. And even if before they say some words, you're kind of they would rhyme a word with a certain word, and you're like you already know that word's coming, and you're like, oh. So there's certain things that there is a little bit of level of cheesiness in their words, and sometimes their music can be kind of straightforward and still catchy, but it can be on the sort of lighthearted. But it is like a PG version of rock music, and I think anybody that has a couple Alan Parsons Project albums like enjoys it, and it's nice to hear music that isn't so serious. Like, I listen to a lot of serious music. I would probably say maybe 80 or 90% of my music is very serious, and I do take electronic music very seriously and music in general. But it is nice to hear some cheesiness here and there. I definitely have my '80s cheesiness, and not to the point where I'm listening to like Whitney Houston or something like that. But I'll put on like the more popular Genesis stuff. Maybe not to the extreme, the worst stuff of Genesis, but I'll play Invisible Touch or something like that, or just that album in general. But so I do like the cheesiness in music. I think there's a lot of certain cheesiness in a lot of '80s dance music. When you think of like freestyle music or um, really any kind of popular dance music, a lot of it was kind of cheesy, and I still like it. And I think over the years it's kind of had a nostalgic way. I mean, even kind of Milli Vanilli or it's kind of in a way kind of fun. CNC Music Factory. I don't know. It's kind of not like I'm going to buy it and play it, but if I heard it, I wouldn't necessarily turn it right off just for a good laugh or maybe enjoy some of the production of it, the old beat machines and things like that. Like I can take pieces out of old music and still enjoy it and not be fully put off like I was probably back in 1990 when I first heard Milli Vanilli, because everything sounded like that with that beat machine. But in a nostalgic way, 35 years later, stuff like CNC Music Factory or Enigma or you know uh, anything that's kind of in there is kind of enjoyable. And when you listen to Alan Parsons Project, they're so talented musicians, and the recordings are done so well, and then they're enjoyable and they're nice and peaceful songs, and nothing's gonna hit you over the head and nothing's gonna be too politically correct. It's mostly written about like love and emotions, and this particular album is kind of themed around gambling and just gambling in general. I don't know if really casinos or anything like that, but it's more about just luck in general and and gambling, and so it's kind of nice that, and that's very a prog rock thing for me, is to put an album into a theme. And so that definitely ties more to prog rock than it would to like soft rock. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna review the 10 songs really quickly, and then go into my overall thoughts. So the first track, it's interesting on this album how many singles there are in this are from this album. Like Games People Play is a single, Time is a single, Turn a Friendly Card is a single, but then also Snake Eyes was a single in a couple countries. I think it was I can't remember which one it was, but then I think it was like Spain and like Portugal, and then Goldbug was a single in like Germany, Turkey, and Austria. So it's I think maybe A Price to Play was also put on 7 inch. So like 6 or 7 of these 10 songs were on 7 inch. So they were really going crazy on that format. But it's interesting, there was certain countries that they sort of took their own singles from this album, to release in those areas. So there's almost like 5 singles on this album, but really 2 or 3 are really in every country. But for most part, there is like 2 or 3 other still 7 inches that were sort of singles in different countries. The first track was actually a single in France too. So maybe A Price to Pay is the first track. The addition of orchestra in this album is really nice. It doesn't go overboard, but there's definitely some nice strings and violins and some underlying, uh, you know, makes the album sound more full. And so I really like the addition of orchestra on this album, and it makes a lot of the tracks even more enjoyable. Uh, I give the first track 5 out of 10 stars. It's not necessarily one of my favorite on the album. In fact, it's probably, if I look at the scores, it's probably my least favorite, which actually it is. Um, it's the groove is solid, the strings are good, but it doesn't really have the catchiness that I look for or the smoothness in Alan Parsons Project. But it's still a pretty solid track. Still give it a pretty good score if on the low side of a 5 out of 10. Games People Play. Certainly one of the better songs on the album. One of the more popular singles of their career. The atmospheric break in the middle is really cool. Uh, if you guys grew up through the late '70s and early '80s like I did, and that music is just, and even into the middle '80s, like it almost seems like every rock song had a guitar solo. Like guitar solos were so popular, and that probably didn't really end until metal ended. With like grunge and stuff like that. You can think of even like Guns N' Roses. Had some guitar solos. So all the way through the early '90s, there were still some guitar solos. But in the late '70s and early '80s and middle '80s, especially middle '80s, like there was so many guitar solos, and they were just everywhere. And here, sure enough, there's a guitar solo, and it's very of the time. It definitely sounds like 1980. When this album was made, but still a really good song. It's catchy as well. I gave it 6.5 stars. Time, my favorite track on the album, 7.5 stars. Sung so smooth, so soft. It's such a gentle song with the violins and the note. There's a note at like 2 minutes and 18 seconds. When he does it twice in the song when he sings it. It's just great. I think Eric Wolfson um, sings this one, and he does a great job on this. I, I really always it's always been one of my favorite Alan Parsons Project song, and I give it a 7.5. Track number 4, I Want to Go Home. It's not bad. I give it 5.5 stars. The Gold Bug is a little bit better. It's an instrumental. I like the keys and the keyboard, and certainly Alan Parsons Project with like Sirius and other songs. Like they do some really good instrumentals, and a lot of times they're a little short, but this one's a little bit longer. But 6.25 stars. Also, the Turn of a Friendly Card. Chris Rainbow sings on this one, and he does one of the best jobs I've heard him do on an Alan Parsons Project song. And although the single is a little bit short, they definitely reprise it at the end of the album as well in the part two of it. But this version, this part, the part one, 7.25 stars. My second favorite song on the album. Love the piano, love the vocal. And then it goes into Snake Eyes, which is an enjoyable soft rock song. It's a little bit funky, a little bit. It's catchy, but not quite on the level of some of the other ones. But I give it 5.75 stars. And then another really solid instrumental in the Aces of Swords. I give this one 6 stars. And then Nothing to Lose, 5.5 stars. And then the album ends on part two of the Turn of a Friendly Card. This one's a little bit more instrumental, but it still goes into the chorus once. And I think if you almost combine the tracks, it's almost a full song. It just seems to be broken up into two. But it's a really nice conclusion of the album. I don't think this version is as good as the first version because doesn't hit the chorus twice like the first one does. And but it's a nice instrumental, different side to it. Sort of a part two of it, and I give it 6.75 stars. It still has pretty much everything that's there in the first one. Again, it just doesn't do the chorus and the verses twice. But overall, I give this album 61.75 stars divided by 10, which is roughly a 61.7. And I rounded up to 62 and gave it a couple extra points for the production and the overall enjoyment of the album. I give it a 64 out of 100, so right in the middle of a good album. It's just a relaxing, well recorded album with good harmonies, good layering, the orchestra, good musicmanship, really good levels on this, nice mastering job, just a really solid late '70s, early '80s kind of soft rock album. Um, it's just it's when you listen to a lot of serious music, sometimes it's just really nice to hear um, an album that's just nice and enjoyable and doesn't really rock the boat or doesn't really take intense listening. And it just kind of reminds me of when I was a kid, when I first got into music and was playing my dad's records when I was 4 or 5 years old. Like that's when this album came out, and production wise, it takes me back to that time, and I really enjoy the recording of a lot of the late '70s albums. It definitely has that shag carpet, you know, nice studio, vibe of just kind of the recording um, vibe of the late '70s. I went to recording school in 1996 at a place called Soundmaster Recording Institute. It was in North Hollywood, California. And I went there in 1996, and I think the school closed down somewhere in like maybe 2007 or 2008 when the headmaster Brian Inglesby he passed away, and he was a notable engineer from the late '60s all the way through the early '70s, and then somewhere in the late '70s, early '80s, he turned the facility of the studio that he built. He turned it into a school. And he was known for recording. I think he recorded some of early Joe Cocker stuff, a lot of Elton John's work. I know he was heavily involved in Jesus Christ Superstar. Um, there's some other stuff he recorded, but I can't sort of place it. But those were probably the three biggest things that I remember: Elton John, Joe Cocker, and and Jesus Christ Superstar. But there was definitely some other kind of rock in there as well, and popular stuff. Maybe the Carpenters were in there and stuff like that as well. But that was kind of his era, right? And so when I listen to albums that are recorded like this, and I think about the recording process, and the studio was very late '70s vibe. I mean, everything was wooden, leather brown couches, like brown and then red kind of shag carpeting, and everything's like nice wood and just this. I mean, we went into that place in the late '90s, and you don't think about it too much because at the time it was only 20 years old, but it was a very '70s vibe. Smoke. There was probably even a smoking room, the patio and stuff like that. It was just that whole type of that vibe of a '70s recording studio. And it reminded me a lot of working at Rumbo Recorders, where I went to work after that. I was a very '70s, '80s, early '80s recording studio as well, which was owned by Captain and Tennille in Canoga Park. And I worked there for about a year as well. And they recorded like No Doubt, Tragic Kingdom, and Appetite for Destruction. But there was a lot of like early uh, rock albums that were recorded there, like Eye and the Tiger by Survivor, and a lot of I think a lot of Dio stuff was done there. Um, War was done there. I know Keb Mo was there from Jazz. He was there, but also I'm blanking on some King Diamond. There's a lot of early kind of '80s rock. Eddie Money was there, and but it's just kind of that vibe of that early '80s studios, late '70s studios was so like intoxicating and so memorable. And when I hear anything from this period, it just reminds me of being in that studio and learning how to use 24 track machines and learning how to use outboard effects. And it just kind of takes me back to that time of learning of being in recording school in the early '90s. And it wasn't like we started to learn Pro Tools and stuff like that, but learning on those old machines and learning like Quadraverb and I mean Space Echo and learning how to use an old compressor and limiter and learning how to master and slave two 24 track machines and learning how to do a mix and learning how to use the outboard effects and aligning machines and learning how to mic instruments and stuff like that. Like being in the studio was such an awesome memory of mine. And whenever I listen to stuff around this period that's also well recorded, it just takes me back to those times. If you've ever been around an old recording studio, you'll know what I kind of feel. And there's a big there's definitely a lost feeling like that, a feeling of nostalgia, and hopefully there's still some old kind of recording studios. I'm sure like Record Plant, and there's some still, some classic ones from in Los Angeles. They're still around. But man, those are great times, and it's just kind of like being around where it's almost like being around because it's very engineer geared because these are all tools of an engineer, but it's not, it doesn't really have the vibe of like all the artists that went through there. Maybe from the outward perspective, it sort of is like, oh, they recorded here, they recorded there. But when you're in there as sort of like an engineer, or in there from looking at from a technical aspect, it's just like a very comfortable home to allow artists to create and to record that process. And that part of it is so exciting, and it's so enjoyable because it allows the artist to be comfortable. I remember we used to have like candles by the recording booth, and like incense by the candle booth, and the proper lighting, and just all the recording booths had like dimmers, and what I mean, like really nice couches, and some of them had like uh they let you smoke in there, and there would be a bar outside. Like it was just made to have artists feel comfortable, and have them kind of feel like rock stars a little bit also. But it's just really enjoyable to kind of like grow up through that and kind of learn in that environment. It was just so memorable. So anyways, I'll stop reminiscing. But yeah, when I listen to albums like this, it just kind of takes me back to those times. And but yeah, really enjoyable album. 64 out of 100. Alan Parsons Project, The Turn of a Friendly Card. Uh, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this album. What's your favorite three, um, maybe Alan Parsons Project albums? And what's your favorite song from this album? I'll be curious to know those. All right, thanks so much.